You are now listening to the Palm Pod, brought to you by RSPO, a global partnership for sustainable palm oil.
Hi, I'm Fara Rom, and you're tuning into the very first episode of the Palm Pod. Listen in for engaging discussions, expert insights, and industry updates on sustainable palm oil, guiding consumers and businesses to make better choices for the planet. In this episode, we will dive into the past, the present, and beyond, touching on the current affairs of sustainable palm oil and exploring what's next. The year 2024 marks the 20th anniversary of RSPO's formation in pursuit of making palm oil sourcing more ethical and more sustainable. So today, we have a special guest speaker, the one and only Hun Sung, or HS for short, the head of standards and the impacts and monitoring evaluation and learning from RSPO. Welcome, HS.
Hello.
Hi, HS. Can you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about your role in RSPO?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is HS Yen. I am Malaysian, and I joined the RSPO in 2018, focusing on data. And I've been with the organization since, picked up a few more responsibilities along the way. I currently lead the standards development and the impacts monitoring, evaluation, and learning functions within the RSPO. So we create standards because we want to create positive impacts. And to report on positive impacts, we need strong standards. So a combination of these two functions within the RSPO allows us to link these two crucial elements together and result in stronger standards that create stronger positive impacts for our three impact pillars, which is people, planet, and prosperity. When I'm not being a geek behind the computer, I like to be outdoors. I like to go diving, go mountaineering when I can. I do volunteer for environmental and social causes, but really the last few years have been very much focusing on making the RSPO a stronger organization.
Thanks for that. That's a really vast description of yourself. I feel like your weekends are very packed every week. Okay, so we can start with the past. So let's begin with a little bit of history of palm oil, because I feel like it's important for our listeners to get a more complete picture of the palm oil industry, the good and bad, definitely. And from this, how sustainable palm oil plays a significant role in changing the industry for the better in the last 2 decades. So, HS, can you give us a brief history of palm oil production and its global significance?
Wow. Okay. Well, this could take a while, but I'll try to give a quick history lesson about palm oil. Palm oil, as we know it, comes from the oil palm. That's a species of palm that originates from West Africa, around the Guinea, Nigeria, Ghana region area. And it's been there for the longest time. Some recorded history dates it back to 5,000 years, but certainly it's been part of the landscape and is also part of the culture. The same way that Gula Melaka is intrinsic to Malaysian culture, or ghee is to Indian culture, or maize is to Central American cultures, palm oil is a part of the West African culture. I was in Africa recently, and we heard a lot of stories. There are entire recipe books that are built around palm oil. And back in the day when we didn't have electricity, and you used to use oil to light street lamps, in West Africa, they used palm oil. So when the rest of the world was out hunting whales for the oil necessary to power fires, West Africa was using palm oil. So it's been part of the landscape. It's been used in farming. It's been used in food systems for a long time throughout recorded and unrecorded history. But what changed? How did palm oil become the commodity that we know it today? Simply put, the agricultural and the industrial revolutions that started in Europe and then moved across the world. That really moved entire societies from subsistence farming to large-scale agriculture, and then led to urbanization and industrialization, building of factories, so on and so forth. Modern society and modern economies as we know it today are built on this foundation. So this shift meant that most of the population was no longer producing food on their own farms for themselves. They were producing large-scale crops to be exported. And a lot of these new innovations in production technologies meant that manual labor could be done away with, and there were a lot of people that needed jobs. They moved to the cities to work in factories. There's a huge increase in population. There's a huge increase in population that need food to eat. And there's also an increase in machines and all other associated methods of production. So things being the way it was back then, with the colonial powers, what the colonial powers such as England, France, Netherlands needed to do was to actually find areas that could produce the raw materials necessary for the industries. And palm oil was one of them. So if you think about the history of commerce, a lot of what we use today is rooted back in those histories. The British came to Malaya to look for tin. That became tin goods. They brought rubber from the Amazon to Malaysia and Indonesia to produce tires. Cotton was widespread across the world. It's needed to produce clothes. And palm oil was needed to make food. It was used as a cooking oil, but it's also used to make soaps. One of the oldest soap brands in the world that you will probably know the name of, Palm Olive, comes from the word palm. And that meant an increase in hygiene. People were living longer, but they live longer, they need to eat more, and they need to do more things in terms of work. And so palm oil was also used as lubricants in machines. All the machines in the factories are made of metal, and if they aren't lubricated and oiled, they will break down. So palm oil became this essential cash crop that powered a lot of the industrialization that happened since the 17th century. Now, in the post-colonial era, after World War II, a lot of the colonies inherited this export-oriented commodity crops. Certainly Malaysia and Indonesia did. And that meant that the palm that was planted during the pre-colonial years were carried over. And that meant that palm's footprint in the modern trade economy was maintained and it became even larger. And that's largely due to two things. One, it's a very versatile product. It's been present in over 50% of any supermarket's products. And also, it's very, very productive. In comparison to other vegetable oils, such as sunflower, soybean oil, rapeseed oil, coconut oil, palm has about 4 times the amount of yield in volume per hectare, and in some cases, even 10 times the yield than other comparable vegetable crops. And that's also because palm is a fruit and it's not a seed. Other vegetable oils tend to come from seeds, but palm is a fruit and you get a lot more oil from that fleshy part of the fruit. So each of these vegetable oils has its own niches, has its own pros and cons and markets. Substitution and blending does happen. That usually happens when prices fluctuate, but that has also resulted through history, productivity, and versatility, the large footprint of palm oil in the modern economy. And that's a lot larger than you might think. So in essence, that's how we got up to today, where palm is part of everyday life, whether you know it or not. And I hope this concludes the history lesson. And I hope that was educational to everyone.
That's more than amazing. I feel like it's such a great overview to see the shift from the origins where palm tree comes from and to this day, and how significant it is in the people's life all over the world. So with that, I think we can shift a little bit of the discussion towards including sustainable palm oil in the discussion, because I think not many people hear this, especially for me. Like before this, I've never heard of the term sustainable palm oil. So can you help describe in the simplest manner, if possible, the difference between sustainable palm oil and conventional palm oil?
Okay, well, I'll try to make this as simple as possible, but it is a complex question to answer. But in essence, the commodity itself is the same. It's an oil. It has the same properties, and it's chemically, biologically. The difference between sustainable palm oil and conventional palm oil would be the practices in which it is produced. So with any agricultural commodity, and this is not just about palm oil, but other crops such as, say, coffee or chocolates, sorry, coffee or cocoa, you need land. That land takes the place of perhaps degraded forests, or perhaps it could be pristine forests. You need workers to go into the land and harvest and do all the necessary industrial processes to turn it from a raw material into a commodity. This is where the practices come in. There are, I suppose, sustainable ways of practices that you can put in place to ensure that the palm oil that is produced is considered sustainable. That isn't to say that conventional is a negative connotation either. It just means that it doesn't have the rules of sustainable production that are inherent in, say, the RSPO standard, which has a defined level of criteria, indicator, and requirements that have to be met in order for palm oil to be considered sustainable. So if you want an analogy, think of the River Thames in London. 200 years ago, it was polluted because there were factories upstream that were releasing waste straight into the water. There was no control in terms of open burning or furnaces, which resulted in smog in London for the longest time, and basically a dead river. No fish lived there. Over 200 years, they've managed to clean it up. And that's by putting in practices in terms of sustainable production and sustainable management of the river. And now the Thames is clean. There was a seal that was found there, I think, 2 years ago. And the air quality in London is a lot better. So that's the difference. It's a difference not in the product itself, but in the practice of production. But the positive impacts of putting those practices in place can actually be huge.
Because I think also it's really important to note out there in the products and all that, like they don't really specify conventional palm oil. So people are not really aware of, the existence of even sustainable palm oil. So maybe we can say sustainable palm oil, the sustainable word is the responsible processes that took place in producing palm oil. Am I correct?
Yes, that's entirely true. And that doesn't mean to say that conventional palm oil is irresponsible. They may be produced using responsible practices. It's just not necessarily according to the full rule book that, say, RSPO produces. So that generally isn't a distinguishing wording between conventional sustainable palm oil in an ingredients list, but the RSPO does have a trademark that can be used in products to denote that that product contains sustainable palm oil, or at least sustainable palm oil as defined by the RSPO.
Okay, so I think it's a bit interesting when you said sustainable practices. So what does it really mean? Like, what does it entails? What are the key principles that define sustainable palm oil?
Well, sustainability means different things to different people, but in a roundtable like sustainable palm oil, it is about balance. And the balance that we're talking about here is the balance between our three impact pillars, the three areas that RSPO wants to have a positive impact in the world. And that's people, planets, and prosperity. So the whole ecosystem of RSPO standards, systems, and procedures is about protecting the environment, ensuring that workers, labor, and communities and land is protected, socially responsible, and at the same time allowing for economic development and businesses to be viable. So the challenge here is that we can't have one or the other. We have to have all three in balance. And proof of that is that you can be sustainable and profitable at the same time. You can practice sustainable practices and not be a drag on the viability of the industry or your livelihood or even your company. So together, that's what constitutes sustainability in an RSPO context.
Is it difficult when we say sustainable practices to produce certain commodities such as palm oil? What are the biggest challenges that you see when we want to ensure the sustainability of the commodities, which in this topic today that we talk about sustainable palm oil?
Yep. So the first thing to realize that sustainability doesn't happen overnight. It is a long race, and it has a lot of elements, some of which can be put into place fairly quickly, but some may take years to actually put put in place. So the rules and the general themes around sustainability are quite commonplace. They are permeated through various aspects of everyday life, including ESG reporting, corporate sustainability directives, due diligence, so on and so forth. But you have the rules. People still need to be aware of those rules and be able to apply that and apply that consistently. So the current status, I suppose, of RSPO is that the awareness is there. It's about scale and penetration. We've managed to certify 20% or so of palm oil production globally as sustainable in the 20 years that RSPO has been in existence. And that's a considerable amount, considering that that's 1/5 of the world's palm oil supply. Now, the other part of this is you can produce it, but someone still has to buy it for markets to work. So on the downstream side, we do also see the need for global markets, and this include private actors such as companies, but also international organizations or governments to prioritize sustainable sourcing to increase the demand of sustainable products. And I say products because it's not just palm oil, but sustainably produced products in general, such as coffee or sugar. Because at the end of the day, we are all economic actors, and it boils down to supply and demand. If someone has it and I want it, I will buy it. And the more people want to buy it, the more supply will come in.
Okay, so it's more of awareness of the people to increase the demand for sustainable palm oil.
Yes, I think that's the challenges that we need. How do we get people more aware? And once they're aware, how do we get them to be more engaged and participate in a sustainable economy?
Okay, so like you mentioned in the past, like the overview of palm oil in general, we can see there's an increasing demand year by year for palm oil. And I believe there's a lot of negative sentiments, especially in the global north, where there's a narrative that says palm oil has been linked to deforestation and loss of biodiversity. How does RSPO mitigate that?
Well, okay, I mean, this is rooted in where palm oil is produced, but also why it has been produced in an increasing scale over the years. But to answer the first part, palm oil grows around the equatorial region between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. So that covers the Amazon and the other naming areas in Latin America. It covers the Congo Basin in West Africa. It covers the very ancient virgin rainforests in Borneo and Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, and so on and so forth. These are the most biodiverse areas in the world and some of the largest carbon sinks in the world as well. Most of the world's intact rainforests and also valuable ecosystems are in this region. Now, the other part of that is this is also the region in the world where over 3 billion people live. And that population is growing. I think the UN projects that we will be hitting 10 billion people within the next 50 years. Most of those 10 billion people will be living in the equatorial regions. So they have needs too. They need to develop. The governments need to develop their economies. The people need to have jobs, to have food to eat, and they turn to what's available to them. So deforestation has been an issue because, and biodiversity is an aspect of that because these are the most biodiverse regions in the world. We can't stop economic development altogether. That would be unrealistic to do. You can't tell a country you can't clear any of your forests because, essentially that means you're saying, oh, we don't want you to develop. But how can they develop in a responsible way? So RSPO does have a lot of mechanisms within our standards, within our membership on identification assessment for land that could be economically developed or has to be conserved because it's valuable. We also have other procedures such as our remediation and compensation procedure, the RECP, where companies that go for certification have to remediate for historical deforestation through projects. So in that sense, we do address that situation. and conserve areas that need to be conserved, especially areas where biodiversity is highest and what we call RTE, rare, threatened, and endangered species live, but still allow for economies to develop and palm oil to be cultivated for the economic well-being of the people that actually live.
In relation to the conversation of the environment, there's an increasing talk about the concerns of carbon emissions. Can you explain a little bit of what is the connection between palm oil plantations and carbon emissions, and how would this be addressed through sustainable practices?
Well, you ask such simple questions, Farah. Okay. First of all, the issue of climate change and its association with carbon emissions has many different dimensions. Let's talk about the oil palm itself. The oil palm is a perennial crop. It is not an annual crop, which means that you plant it and it stays there for about 25 years, which is the productive life cycle of a palm. Annual crops, such as, say, soybean or wheat, you plant it, you harvest it, and then you till the land and you plant it again. So it's planted annually. That's a crucial distinguishing factor between palm and other vegetable oils, because once you plant a palm and it grows, it stores carbon in its trunks, in its leaves, so on and so forth. So that's one thing to note. The oil palm is a plant, and it in itself is a store of carbon. What we're concerned with when it comes to the production and cultivation of palm oil is how much carbon will be released when you develop the land that you're going to plant the oil palm on. And what about your ongoing operational emissions when it comes to operating your mill, your factory, your vehicles, so on and so forth. So there's two aspects to that. One is emissions reduction. So any industrial process, and it's not just palm oil, involves some level of emissions release. You turn on your stove, you're releasing carbon. You start your car, you're releasing carbon. Yep. But the idea is, how do you offset that, or at least mitigate that, by reducing that amount to a level where it is not completely irresponsible, but can be mitigated and can always be reduced further. So in terms of emissions reductions, we have aspects in the standards that ask our certified members to assess what the areas of carbon emission risk are and take steps to reduce, mitigate, and minimize those emissions. And these can be things such as the treatment of waste, how you throw away biological waste, which generates methane, and methane is a greenhouse gas. It is also a reduction of fossil fuels. We encourage that certified units reduce their usage of fossil fuels in favor of, say, batteries or renewables. So you reduce the amount of fuel that you're using. And also things such as fertilizer. Instead of perhaps getting fertilizer from 6,000 miles away in Russia, you could use local alternatives or practice or certain level of recycling nutrients from organic material around. And these are sustainable practices that will ultimately also lead to lower emissions in an operational sense. And then there's emissions avoidance. And this is trying to avoid releasing any carbon that's stored in the first place. The oil palm itself is a store of carbon, but land contains carbon. So when you're developing land, you would be releasing carbon. And we have seen that in the charts of research conducted on the carbon release of oil palms. There's always a spike at the initial start where land is being cleared or land is being repurposed for a new generation of palm oil. And then the emissions start to drop because what has been planted starts to store carbon. Now, this is quite crucial. This is where it ties into deforestation from the previous question. The more you conserve, the more carbon is not released. And this is particularly true of peatlands, tropical peatlands, which are a huge store of carbon. We saw in Malaysia, Indonesia, and our parts of the world in Southeast Asia, haze. Every year, there's always the risk of haze. People get scared around this time of the year. What's going to happen? A lot of that is rooted in the unsustainable practice of open burning in critically high carbon sequestration areas, such as peatlands. And peatlands are the swamps that contain millions of years of organic material, and it's been decaying. And if you leave it there, the carbon will stay there. But if you burn it and if you clear it, the carbon is released. So that's how we try to avoid the release of emissions in the first place. And it's quite crucial because the largest tropical peatland in the world is actually in West Africa. It's the Cuvette Centrale in the Congo Basin. And if we can put sustainable practices in at this point before that area has been begun full-scale development, we could very well be preventing a disaster from happening in the future. And that's essentially it. How do we address climate change through carbon emissions, through what an oil plant plantation can do? And that's through mitigating its emissions and avoiding the release of emissions itself. That being said, this is also rooted in supply and demand. One of the reasons why palm oil production has increased quite significantly over the past few years is because of climate change again. There was a concerted effort, certainly in the EU, to tackle the use of fossil fuels, which are a major contributor to climate change, by switching to biofuels. And at that point, one of the favorite biofuels was palm oil. Now, that perception has now shifted, and palm oil that used to be seen as a better alternative to fossil fuel is now in itself being seen as an issue for climate change. So the perceptions will evolve, but what our mission is at RSPO is still the same. We want to mitigate and minimize emissions, and where we can, we want to avoid the release of stored carbon at all, if possible.
So from what a lot of the things that you shared, sustainable practices doesn't have to be a vast, a big step. There's always something, like you mentioned, getting the fertilizers from locally and not from abroad. So there's a lot of different, I feel like it's really interesting to see, especially in agricultural practices, that we can shift towards a sustainable future, and it's possible, even though it's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah,
so,
I think there's always a first step. And if you take that first step, then you can take another step and another step and another step, because ultimately sustainability is a marathon. It's a very, very long race. And what we want everyone to be aware of is that it is a race, but you have to take that first step. And if enough people are in the race, it gets easier and easier. But we also hope that we don't make sustainability so lofty or onerous that people drop out of the race itself. We have to balance that. But the ultimate goal is still the same. But the ultimate goal is afar off. You have to take the first step and take the next few steps. And those might be the easier parts. But there are ways, and there are a lot of assistance mechanisms within the RSPO, within governments, in inculcating sustainable practices in terms of production.
Okay, so I feel like we've touched almost somehow a lot of the points, and I think our listeners also can understand a bit further of what sustainable palm oil is, and what is happening now and what are we facing. And as for RSPO, in your point of view, where is RSPO? Which stage is RSPO in now? And where would you like to see the palm oil industry headed over the coming decade?
Well, I mean, I can only speak for myself, because different people will have different metrics for where RSPO is. But if we look statistically, RSPO represents 20% of global palm oil production. In terms of influence, we're actually at about 40%, because the RSPO members collectively produce about 40% of the world's palm oil. The remaining 20% is actually in the process of certification, and certification does take a while to achieve sometimes. So in terms of influence, it's wider than the 40%. And in terms of actual awareness, I think RSPO, certainly in its 20 years, has managed to make the world aware that sustainability is a priority in palm oil production, and the various mechanisms of sustainability that should be practiced in terms of, say, human rights, environmental protection, climate change, even to things such as women's safety or gender empowerment.
Great. So, last but not least, I feel like you've touched a little bit of this as well, but I think it's good to kind of finish up our conversation with this, because I feel like it's an important point every time we discuss about the palm oil industry. Because like you mentioned, it always boils down to supply and demand on how we can shift conventional palm oil practices towards sustainable palm oil. So how can consumers, can you just give like a few tips on how can consumers or individuals like myself to get involved or contribute to the global movement for sustainable palm oil?
So I'm gonna kind of like reject that question as well and just not focus on sustainable palm oil, but sustainable products in general, because focusing on just palm doesn't mean ignores the rest, the other sustainable production produced commodities out there, and it's all rooted in the same thing, which is awareness. So RSPO, as our central tenets, we want to certify, we want to collaborate, and we want to communicate about sustainability. So we work together with our members, with our partners, and convene together to create change. Certification is an avenue and a step towards that, and we would like to communicate on the positive impacts that certification can bring. Now, that means we have to reach a wide audience in order to have transformative scale. We've got to 20% of the world's production in 20 years. How do we get further? How do we reach the people that perhaps haven't heard that message, or are perhaps not in a position to understand how they do it? And that's where awareness comes in. And again, it's not just true of palm oil. There are many sustainability standards out there that cover other products that are in your everyday life. Sugar is represented by the Bon Sucro standard, for example, paper products by FSC, seafood by MSC, cotton, the shirts that you buy from Uniqlo, that's BCI, coffee, cocoa, Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade. There's a whole ecosystem of organizations like RSPO working towards sustainable production, because all these products are still rooted in the same aspects of sustainability, reducing deforestation, protecting human rights, while ensuring that economic viability. So once you know that these things are out there and you're aware that they exist, you should look up for them. We have trademarks. A lot of the other standards have trademarks as well. And you know that the point, and you and you make an economic choice as an individual person to choose sustainability. And that would mean looking out for information on what products are made using sustainable commodities and making that choice to buy that, because that sends a signal. You are creating demand for that particular product. And if enough people demand for that, the supply will follow. And myself, I've become hyper aware of what I consume as an individual since I joined the RSPO. Because Farah, I was like you when I first started. I didn't know what was going on, but I look up for labels these days. I look up for trademark these days, and I make an economic choice to that. Okay, I'm going to buy this. It might cost a little more, but I'm saving the planet, and I'm ensuring that every worker involved in it has a fair and equal chance of work without discrimination, and all the other tenets of sustainability. So individually, I might be a drop, but if enough people have drops, then it becomes a ripple. And if there are enough ripples, then that whole thing becomes a tidal wave. And that could really, really change things. But you have to start from somewhere. And the only thing that everyone really has in their control is themselves. So if you make the choice, and hopefully everyone else makes the same choice by communicating and collaborating, the movement becomes bigger and bigger, and the demand becomes bigger and bigger, and supply will have to follow.
I feel like that's a great way to summarize our discussion for today. First episode of the Palm Pot, Sustainable Palm Oil, the Past, the Present, and Beyond. Thank you so much, Asesh, for your time. I think I've learned a lot from today's episode. Do you have like 2 or 3 words to close our session?
No, just thank you very much for inviting me to be the first participant in the Palm podcast. Stay tuned for more Palm Pods. We'll have a lot of interesting topics coming up. Sustainability is a complex issue, and it will be fascinating to dive in and hear from all our very learned colleagues and collaborators on the different aspects of sustainability.
Thank you so much. I was speaking to our guest, HS, the head of standards and impacts and monitoring, evaluation and learning IML from RSPO. I am Fara Rom, and this is the Palm Pod by RSPO, a global partnership to make palm oil sustainable.